Aloha! Coming from our nation's capital in Washington, D.C., welcome to my show, Conversations with Kai, where every month I sit down with a national elected leader and subject matter expert to discuss issues important to Hawaii and our nation. Our country is at an inflection point. We've already seen President Biden's American Rescue Plan have a tremendous effect on middle-class families, from the child tax credit to stimulus checks in people's pockets. Now, as we continue on the road to recovery, our vision is not just to return to a pre-pandemic normal, but to build back better by making huge investments in our future to tackle the climate crisis, eliminate food and housing insecurity, and break systemic inequalities that affect so many of our communities. Today, I'm so excited to be joined by a very special guest, my colleague, my teammate on the congressional baseball team, the gentleman from the great state of New York, the chairman of the Democratic Caucus, Hakeem Jeffries. Now, the Democratic Caucus includes every single Democratic member of Congress in the U.S. House of Representatives. Under the leadership of the chairman, the caucus helps our party achieve consensus and provides members with the tools they need to fulfill their goals. Congressman Jeffries represents New York's 8th Congressional District, which covers parts of Brooklyn and Queens. Chairman, it's an honor to have you on our show. In fact, you and I have a few things in common. Prior to both coming to Congress, we both served in the state legislature. And I just wanted to give you a chance to please tell us a bit about yourself and your leadership role in Congress to the people of Hawaii.
First of all, aloha.
Aloha.
It's great to see you.
Mahalo.
Appreciate you and your leadership within the House Democratic Caucus, for the Congress, and of course for the country, most importantly for your constituents back at home.
Yeah.
You know, I've got the opportunity to serve both as the Congressman from the 8th Congressional District in Brooklyn and Queens, back at home, now serving in my 5th term, and then I'm also in my 2nd term as chair of the House Democratic Caucus, which, as you mentioned, is the sort of central organizing umbrella of Democrats in the House of Representatives, under the tremendous leadership, of course, from Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Hoyer, Majority Whip Jim Clyburn. The caucus is really the body where we come together to work through the issues that are on the agenda for the people as it relates to advancing the ball, whether it's in the area of the economy, job creation, housing, dealing with child care, dealing with the climate crisis. We are a very diverse caucus, one of the most diverse caucuses in the history of the Republic, with more people of color serving in Congress than ever before, more women serving in Congress than ever before, more members of the LGBTQ community.
Indigenous community?
And the indigenous community as well.
Hawaiians, we're back in Congress.
Absolutely, which is an amazing thing.
Yes, sir.
And of course, one of the first 2 Native American women ever elected from the great state of Kansas. And so the caucus, I believe, represents the most authentic representation here in Washington on behalf of the American people, because we are the American people.
When I was campaigning for Congress, coming up here to Washington, D.C., putting on my shoes, not knowing anybody, and walking the streets and walking the hill, we had a chance to meet for the very first time, and I never forgot the time you took to take out of your schedule to meet me and provide me a little bit of words of wisdom and some mentorship in what it would take to be here. That was about a year and a half ago, and it's, you know, it's an honor for me to be sitting here with you now and representing Hawaii's 2nd Congressional District. But Mr. Chairman, before we get to business, I want to ask you one question. Now, you're from New York, the city that never sleeps. So what's an insider tip that a New Yorker like yourself could offer an island boy like me when visiting the Big Apple?
Well, you know, the interesting thing is that we're also part of an island. Now, it's the broader Long Island. You've got Brooklyn, Queens, Nassau, and Suffolk County. And one of the more fascinating things about the district that I represent, of course, some traditionally African-American neighborhoods in central Brooklyn, like a Fort Greene, a Clinton Hill, Bedford-Stuyvesant, downtown Brooklyn, neighborhoods that many people, perhaps from beyond the city of New York, are familiar with. But I also represent several neighborhoods that are immediately adjacent to the Atlantic Ocean. Beach communities like Coney Island, Brighton Beach, Manhattan Beach, a neighborhood called Howard Beach, and Canarsie. They're adjacent to Jamaica Bay. Now, our beaches are not as beautiful as yours in Hawaii.
It's Waikiki.
I want to be clear about that. Very different dynamic. But these are also coastal communities and very diverse communities as well. And so the thing that I'd say about New York City is that it's wonderful if you ever have the opportunity to travel the world.
Yeah.
And everybody should have that opportunity in different ways, but it's time and it's expensive to be able to do that. But if you can't travel the world, you can come to New York City and see the world in almost every different community. And many of those communities I'm privileged to represent.
And how did that city, that community, how did that shape you and some of the values you have in being here today? I know what my hometown of Hilo, my ancestral home of Miloli'i on Hawaii Island, small little native Hawaiian fishing village, how it shaped my values and got me here. But what about before you got here, bringing you to Congress?
Well, I grew up in a working class neighborhood, Crown Heights in central Brooklyn, and came of age during a very challenging time for the city of New York. It was in the midst of the crack cocaine epidemic, 2,000 plus homicides in New York City. Very difficult, dangerous place. But through all of that adversity, the community was there for me, there for my younger brother, of course, starting with my parents and my grandparents, but the broader village of Brooklyn in many ways, determined to make sure that as many of us as possible could see our way through to a better life. And I've never forgotten that. The people who were there for all of us. It also helped to shape, I think, those tough times, and I say this to young people now, that, life is filled with ups and downs, with highs and lows, with peaks and valleys, with trials and tribulations. As a master pilot, that you can't normally get from your point of departure to your point of destination without, at some moment along the way, encountering turbulence.
Right.
Sometimes it's real bad,
Right.
Sometimes it's light. In many ways, that's life's journey. And growing up in Brooklyn and New York City at that time, dealing with a lot of turbulence, I think has helped to strengthen my resolve so that whenever some rough moments are in front of us, whether that's here in Washington and we deal with a lot of legislatively tough moments and some rough folks on the other side of the aisle and a rough former president, that we understand that that is just a part of the journey.
Yeah.
We can overcome that adversity and continue to make it to the other side.
I think about little kids back home in Hawaii. I think about single mothers back home in Hawaii. I try and use as a benchmark, if what I'm doing here is helping their lives, and you think about those kids back in Brooklyn, those little kids growing up there, and the impact that we're able to make together for their futures.
Yeah, one of the things about the House is that it was designed by the framers of the Constitution, and you live this every day that you're here, as you've articulated, and I've just seen it in all of your work, that the focus is on how am I making life better for the people I was privileged to serve.
Right.
And I think the House, as different than the Senate and the presidency and the Supreme Court, was designed to be the institution that was closest to the people. It's the reason why we only have a 2-year term, as opposed to the presidency, 4 years, the Senate, 6, Supreme Court, life tenure. Yeah. So that, in the words of the framers, it's the House that's going to reflect the passions of the people. Yeah. My view, broader than the passions, the hopes, the dreams, the aspirations, addressing the fears, the concerns, and the anxieties of the people, and yes, of course, their passions. And so to me, that's what makes us a special institution, that all of us come from different communities to make life better for those folks who are back at home.
And let's talk about some of those hopes and dreams and values and aspirations, because Democrats right now are working tooth and nail to pass President Biden's Build Back Better agenda, to deliver life-changing benefits for working families across the nation. And you've said many times during our weekly caucus meetings, Tuesday mornings, and in live interviews, that Build Back Better isn't just about returning back to normal. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I think as you mentioned at the top of the program so appropriately, we made a promise to the American people that we would not go back to pre-pandemic normal.
Right.
Because prior to the pandemic, half the American people had indicated consistently in survey after survey that they couldn't afford a sudden, unexpected $400 expense. This is in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. And the American dream has always been that if you work hard and play by the rules, you should be able to provide a comfortable living for yourself and for your family and retire with grace and dignity.
Right.
But for far too many everyday Americans, that basic contract is broken. It's been stamped null and void. And so we can't go back to that pre-pandemic condition. We have to build back better. And President Biden was very explicit as candidate Biden that that's exactly the agenda that he was going to work to execute for the people. And he's got amazing partners, yourself included, right at the top of that list, in getting that work done in the House.
Okay. Well, let's jump to some of the key components of that Build Back Better plan. And one of the things that is important to Hawaii and the residents of the 2nd Congressional District is clean energy. And in some cases, in many cases, Hawaii has been a leader in clean energy. And we have wind, we have solar generation, we got hydro, geothermal. We have a lot of opportunities to generate clean energy. Now we know that, and the scientists have said that to reduce our emissions by at least half by 2030, and in order to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis, and make no mistake, those impacts are happening upon us today. You know, increasing temperatures across the planet, intense storms like we just saw in New York City, and they're happening with more frequency, rising sea levels, which are really important to small island nations throughout the Pacific, and in many times coastal erosion due to rising sea levels. We must embrace the clean energy agenda. That does not include fossil fuels. So what investments with Build Back Better are we going to do to make and reduce our footprint, to invest in clean energy, and to revitalize a healthy and habitable planet for my kids, your kids, and for future generations?
You know, such an important question in terms of dealing with the climate crisis, which clearly has to be addressed with the fierce urgency of now. There is no planet B, right? It's now or never in terms of a dramatic and decisive intervention. And so our view from the very beginning was that any investments that we make in our economy and our infrastructure have to be green, resilient, and sustainable. And that means dramatically reducing our carbon footprint, and at the same time, as you've indicated, making investments in clean energy, largely through wind and solar. And so we dramatically expand the clean energy tax credits connected to wind and solar to incentivize capital investment and additional innovation so we can stand up the clean energy sector of the economy, create the type of investments necessary that will lead to dramatically increased clean energy production and a significant number of good paying jobs. Because we recognize that we have to transition folks from the economy as it exists right now, including in the energy space, to the economy of the future. But we're determined to win the future, both in terms of the livelihood and the jobs that will be created, and in terms of having a livable and sustainable planet.
One of the things for climate change I'm really excited about is the investment that we're going to make in sustainable aviation fuel research and development. As an airline pilot and, part of the airline industry for most of my life, we need to address that. And the airline industry and the general aviation manufacturers in our country want us to invest in sustainable aviation fuels so we can operate those aircraft in a much more cleaner way. Let's jump to middle class and working class families. Chairman, the American Rescue Plan we passed back in March provided the largest child tax credit ever to the most working families ever. And in our districts combined, it's lifting over 22,000 children out of poverty, but there are only 3 payments left, as you all know. And we often say our middle class and working class families are the backbone of our economy. How does Build Back Better and that agenda strengthen America's working families and their children?
Such an important question. The expanded and improved child tax credit that was initially contained in the American Rescue Plan was a substantial step forward for middle-class families, working families, and low-income families. It was a trifecta in terms of winning across the economic spectrum from low to moderate to middle class. But now we have to extend it because it is scheduled to expire with the December payment. And it has provided resources for families all across America to provide for basic needs, food and shelter and diapers and rent and clothes.
Utilities.
And utilities. And we have to keep it going. And we will keep it going as part of the Build Back Better Act. We will extend it, if not make it permanent. And we are on track to make sure that we can get that done. As you also indicated, the expanded and improved child tax credit is one of perhaps the largest anti-poverty initiatives in American history, lifting tens of thousands of children in our respective districts out of poverty, and millions of children throughout the country, putting them in a better place to be able to eventually live that great American dream. And we can't abandon it, and we won't.
Like you said earlier in your opening comments about America being one of the richest country in the world, no child should go hungry at night. No child should grow up in poverty. And I think that child tax credit goes a long, long way. And I'm looking forward to making that permanent, with your help and the help of our caucus. Let's jump to healthcare, Medicare expansion. One of the issues in our country that has probably polls at the highest and one of the most highest support out there. The holes in Medicare coverage are harming our seniors. Back in Hawaii, we call them our kupuna. They're the most precious people we have. And they've been pushed. Their basic health care has been out of reach and pushed out for far too long. So among Medicare beneficiaries, 75% of people who needed a hearing aid did not have one. 70% of people who had trouble eating because of their teeth did not go to a dentist in the past year. And 43% of people who had trouble seeing did not have an eye exam in the past year. How does Build Back Better reimagine Medicare for our seniors in terms of vision, dental, and hearing?
Well, those are 3 critical areas, particularly for seniors who confront deterioration of your dental condition over the years, certainly of your sight and of your hearing. And of course, Medicare does not cover those 3 areas. And it's our intention with the Build Back Better area to change that and to expand the coverage in a way that I think is consistent with the original intent of Medicare, which is to be there for seniors during their golden years. As you indicated, these are the most precious amongst us. We stand on their shoulders. And continuing the promise of Medicare, which of course was begun under the leadership of President Johnson as part of the war on poverty, and it's been an incredibly successful program starting in 1965, is incredibly important. It's what Democrats are all about. That's what the Caucus is all about. And so in this legislation, it's our intention to broaden that coverage in a groundbreaking way. Since I arrived in Congress in 2013, there are people who have wanted to get this done, but now is our opportunity to do it. And it's a high priority for President Biden and a high priority for us.
Before we jump off of Medicare and jump to the pay-fors, I also want to add in and get your thoughts on prescription drug prices and how Medicare does not have the ability to negotiate that. And I'm coming from the perspective as someone who's in the military, part of the DOD and eventually the VA healthcare system, that does have the ability to negotiate and use the U.S. government's purchasing power with the pharmaceutical industry to make those prescription medications affordable for our veterans and our service members, but we don't do it for our kupuna, our elderly, 65 years in age or over. Why is that so important that we address that and build back better?
Yeah, America pays more for prescription drugs and life-saving medication than any other developed country in the world. And in some cases, we pay 4 or 5 or 6 times the amount for the same drug manufactured in the same location that Canada or Australia or Israel or France or Great Britain or Germany pay for the same drug manufactured in the same location. And the fundamental reason for that is that under federal law, Medicare and the federal government are explicitly prohibited from using their bulk price purchasing power, meaning Medicare serves tens of millions of Americans, to get a better price. That's a basic principle of American capitalism. And the federal government is being denied the capacity to negotiate prices on behalf of our seniors. It's unacceptable. And it was a provision that was put into law in 2003 or 2004 at the explicit request of Big Pharma.
Right.
And it's time to end the negotiation prohibition.
We're going to fix that. Mr. Chair, one of the questions I hear often from concerned constituents back home right now is how will we as a country be able to afford spending $3.5 trillion when we have already accumulated so much debt? $1 trillion is a lot of money, let alone trillions and trillions of dollars. But we know this concern is a common misconception. While everyday people pay their fair share in taxes, the top 1% are avoiding paying $163 billion in taxes a year, which will amount to as much as $7 trillion in lost revenue over the next decade. Can you explain how we will pay for Build Back Better and how this investment in America will continue to pay dividends for generations to come?
Such an important question. It's time for the wealthy, the well-off, and the well-connected to pay their fair share so that we can make the type of investments necessary to lift up the American middle class, all those who aspire to be part of the middle class, the poor, the sick, the afflicted, the least, the lost, and the left behind.
Yep.
Particularly in a situation where in 2017, when Republicans controlled the House, the Senate, and the presidency, their primary public policy accomplishment was to pass the GOP tax scam, a so-called tax cut bill where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthiest 1% in America, simply to subsidize the lifestyles of the rich and shameless. It was outrageous. And we are going to roll back many of those tax giveaways that were embedded into that bill and use the rollbacks to help fund the Build Back Better Act. And it's important to note that our legislation, both the bipartisan infrastructure agreement and the Build Back Better Act, the $3.5 trillion bill that you refer to, are going to be fully paid for. And not a single American who makes $400,000 or less will pay a dime in additional taxes.
Right.
which is the promise that President Biden made. It's also important to note that the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better Act is a 10-year investment. So that means that we'll invest approximately $350 billion in additional funding per year over a 10-year period of time. Certainly, that's something that the American economy can absorb. As distinct from the emergency bills that were passed initially on a bipartisan basis in terms of the CARES Act in the last Congress, 2.2, 2.3 trillion, and the American Rescue Plan, which we passed earlier this year under the leadership of Joe Biden and House and Senate Democrats, that was 1.9 trillion. But that was money that was invested immediately to deal with the once-in-a-century pandemic that we were addressing, because it required a once-in-a-century comprehensive and compassionate response. That's distinct than a 10-year investment, which is paid for, and which is the fiscally responsible thing to do, and it will pay dividends because it's going to lift up working class folks and middle class folks and those who aspire to be part of the middle class throughout the country.
I think one thing to just piggyback on what you said about the pay-fors is you talked about America's investment in the future. And just so my constituents back home are aware, the U.S. gross domestic product annually is about $24 trillion, give or take. And so over the course of 10 years, we're talking $280 trillion is the U.S. gross domestic product over the next 10 years. So this $3.5 trillion investment or $350 billion annual investment that you mentioned of new investment money is a small piece, I guess you could say, of the overall gross domestic product that our country needs to and will invest in the future of our country. So,
very important point. Small piece that will pay big dividends, because we're investing in education, we're investing in job training, we're investing in transportation, we're investing in a sustainable climate moving forward, investing in clean energy, investing in child care, investing in home care and health care.
Yep.
In the ways that we've discussed, all of which will inure to the benefit of everyday Americans and the economy.
Yep. We're almost done. Real quick, people from Hawaii get an opportunity to come to New York City. We have a direct flight. Any recommendations in terms of something to see, something to do in New York City?
Well, you know, I'm certainly partial to the Coney Island portion of my district. It's known often as the world's greatest playground,
yep,
and amusement park. It's got some of the world's greatest people.
Yep. And
it's not just the rides. It's the beaches, it's the diversity, it's Nathan's,
yep,
you know, it's the Cyclone, which, you know, is a roller coaster that, you know, I think may be the only wooden roller coaster remaining in the country, if not the world. It certainly is an adventure, but it's a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And so when you fly into JFK, if you're heading to Manhattan, you can take the Belt Parkway, stop off in Coney Island. It's absolutely worth it.
Well, thanks so much, Chairman Jeffries. Mahalo for joining the show.
Appreciate you.
Aloha.
All right.